Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of the hosts for Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. In this episode, we discuss research that supports using social emotional learning to build academic achievement and attendance. And when I listened to this conversation, what I really enjoyed was the healthy critique of a program like the one that's described in this research from Hawaii. Now, I think learning and understanding more about non-academic learning is really important because it can help with student achievement and attendance. And if you're currently spending a lot of time and money on improving math and literacy scores, then this episode is for you. Social emotional learning improves the math and the literacy. That's what this research says. So some of the main topics we'll be covering include a prescriptive program for the whole school for the whole year has big advantages, and we talk about that and some of the drawbacks. Restorative practices, secondly, can work with a program like this one to provide the structures for the conversations in things like circles. Now, at the end of this episode, be sure to visit our website, www.restorative.ca, where you can find free restorative resources plus links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoy this, be sure to subscribe to Circle Forum on YouTube. Now, let's head over to the conversation with Shelley, Steve, and me, Stan. Some really interesting results around social emotional learning as part of a packaged program. Let's talk a little bit about what it is that they're doing and maybe a bit of a critique of this from a restorative perspective.
That article that took place in Hawaii, it's interesting. They had quite a number of schools, and they started with elementary schools and moved into secondary schools. But it was using a very prescriptive program called positive action, where teachers had to do some training with it in order to implement it. And they had so many, certain number of minutes per day stretched over the school year of implementing the program, such as it was outlaid. And then of course the data gathering was following. They had various stages throughout that. So it was a very prescribed program, which is okay. For teachers who aren't comfortable with it, they've got a script or whatever it is they can do, and they can follow it. And so from that standpoint, it's okay. It's a good starting point. And obviously, if you're doing some empirical study and you want some data, you can't have too many people doing things too differently, because then it skews your data and all that kind of jazz. So I think from that standpoint, from study point, it's a good start.
And what they were really doing was trying to extend the research on ways that changing a child's developmental status affects in the non-academic areas will affect in their academics, their discipline, and their attendance needs. So they were giving us some good information there about what works.
Yeah, and I like that part of it. And intuitively, it makes sense, right? If you work on the social emotional development of students, that's going to have a positive impact on the school. But what they're doing is it's not just a positive impact on the school. It also improves student achievement and attendance, which are things that we want to see happen in schools. What about the limitations of this?
Well, the limitation is it's the prescriptive part of it. I mean, it's, as I say, for some teachers that's great, and as a starting point, it's great, but it can limit you if you've got a class, and older kids especially, that really started a great conversation about a specific topic, and you're saying, "Oh, wait a minute, we have to stop now because we're going to only do 15 minutes a day according to this." It does limit you, and the three of us have talked about this a long time, and I think many people who've done restorative practices for years realize that you have to kind of take the conversation in the direction it's going to a degree, and be a little more organic and flexible. And so sometimes a prescriptive program trying to get specific results doesn't allow for that. So to me, that's a limitation on how to teach. But as I say, for a lot of teachers, that's great. They like that because they're not comfortable with letting things go a bit more.
Yeah, and as a limitation, again, when you're time limited or resource limited, it probably isn't going to feel very authentic. And the people that you're trying to share it with or teach to it are going to feel that too. So we're just going to answer his questions so he can tick it off. And that's what it's going to feel like. So there's no relationship building there. There's no, willing to take any risks or next steps, because it's feeling so prescribed that, okay, here we are doing this right now. And it really isn't open to expanding it. And that certainly limits any of the growth in the discussion.
It's got a huge eye roll factor, right? From teachers when it comes to this, like, oh boy, here we go again, something else, which I experienced as well as a high school teacher. We had 15 minutes. I think it was called a TAP program,
Yes, it
and
was.
15 minutes with our homeroom class. And I never saw these kids for the rest of the day. And I had to, get into these questions about character development and stuff like that. And it just was so disingenuous. And there was just no, and it was first thing in the day, first, right at the
Oh,
beginning of
teenagers
the,
love
oh,
8
that
a.m.
was like,
discussions.
they're all wide awake and, oh, shoot, here comes. So the kids were eye rolling. So there wasn't a whole lot of engagement. Now, what I like about something like this is that in spite of the fact that it's not explicitly restorative, there are a lot of elements of restorative practice in this. Let's pick out some of the things that we say, yeah, that sounds and resonates with a restorative approach as well.
Well, I mean, the word that caught my attention was interactive.
Mhm.
It says the program needs to be interactive, and by interactive, meaning teacher students talking to each other. And to me, that's restorative in itself. And so they talked about increased teacher student contact and communication. They talked about discussion, but there were discussions, could be structured or otherwise. At least they were having discussions, and that in itself was restorative. And so there was those elements of what we have always prescribed to be as restorative were embedded in this positive action program. So I think that's good.
And they weren't clearly spending time specifically. We're not going to talk to the students about attendance. We're not going to talk about academics. We're going to talk about their development of character, their social emotional needs, and what might be presenting to them. And we know this other will come with it rather than, let's talk about your attendance. How have you been doing with that? That's not going to be a relationship builder, probably, if it hasn't been going well.
Well, and here's where restorative practice, to me, anyways, is a huge advantage, regardless of what social emotional learning you're part of. It gives you a structure and a format and circles, for example, to have those interactive conversations, and gives you a way of conducting the conversations around social emotional learning that I think really open up the conversation from the teacher and the student's perspective. So I think restorative practices can really add to this. At the same time, it identifies a number of elements that we think are so crucial in, student achievement, attendance, and so on.
For the benefit of a study, everybody has to follow the same template and the same guidelines and do all the things by the same rules so that they can all this, the data is comparable. But I would hope that good teachers at the end of the study would say, gee, I learned some really interesting skills. I'm going to continue this in my own way. And maybe that's where they sort of break the mold and go off in their own direction, but in a positive way, continuing with the discussions and all that. Because if you do this study for a year and it shows some improvement, I can see a lot of teachers say, hey, that really kind of worked, but I wouldn't do this part of it. But I'm going to do that part of it because that part really made a difference. So maybe change some teacher practice for the future.
Discussions with teachers and students, we're all over that. And while we mentioned the limits of a prescriptive program, restorative practices gives each teacher a structure within which to have those discussions and to have those character building conversations. Restorative circles are ideally suited to build these very relationships. Now, find out more about our work at www.restorative.ca. Email me at stan@restorative.ca, and let's use restorative circles to have those important conversations with students and with teachers.